the last couple of videos, we've been looking at how to make an Angular front end that can log in to an ASP.NET web service using JWTs, JSON Web Tokens. And in this video, I'm going to do exactly the same thing in terms of front end, but this time I'm going to do it in Blazor so that we've got .NET C# on the front end as well as on the backend server. And I've done quite a lot of work in putting that together. So if we just take a look at the application we've already got, then it's got really just like we saw in the Angular. We can list all the reviews, we can list a summary of reviews, and I've got a login page that at the moment it's just set up the form, but it doesn't actually do anything. That's what we're going to look at in this video. And at the moment, if we look at the server, we can see that I have cheated that. I have turned off the authorization. So let's change that. So now we do need to log in and let that run up. And so now what we'll see is if I try to look at all the reviews, we get an error, failed to retrieve data in both cases, so we've got to do the login. So let's take a look at the code that's making all of that work. And so if we just take a quick look around, you can see what I've got is a reviews Razor component, and that's where we've got the table looped through all of the reviews in the list. And you can see that we're using this repository that's been injected, so you can see up there. And the repository that we can see there uses an HttpClientFactory to get hold of the HTTP client, and we've configured that in the program here. So that's where we've configured this client just called Server API and given it the base address, which is coming from the app settings file. Just one quick thing to notice about the app settings file: when you're doing it in Blazor WebAssembly, it has to go in the www root. So we can see it's up there, and that's where we're defining the address of the backend server. But it has to go there because it has to be downloaded and read by the code in the browser. It's not being read on the server like you'd have in a normal app settings file. So that's just one slight thing to notice. But that's where we're getting that from. And then the review repository uses that to get the data from JSON, either all the reviews or gets the summaries. That's what gets put back into the reviews.razor. And then whether we're looking at summaries or at all the reviews is handled by the fact that we've got the all reviews that simply loads up reviews with the style of all, or we've got review summary that loads it up with the style of summary. So that's how we distinguish those. So that's the basic application we've got. And then of course we've got the login, which, as I say, is just the form. There we've got the submit method, but we haven't done anything there. So let's get going on that. And the first thing we need to do is to put in an authentication service, so very much like we did in Angular. So we'll go to services and we'll add in there a new class that we'll call authentication service. And then let's put some useful methods in there. So the first thing we're going to have in there is the login. And so we're going to have this as a public. It's going to have to be asynchronous for reasons we'll see in a moment. So we'll have an async task. And if you remember the way we've done this before, we want the login simply to return a date time, which is going to be the time at which the JWT expires. And we'll call this login async because it's an async function. And that's going to take a login model, which I've already defined. That's the model that we were using in the form inside the login component. And we can see that it just contains the username and the password. You can see there. So that's what we'll have coming in there. And then what do we do with that? Well, we're going to use, again, the HTTP client that we're going to get from the HttpClientFactory. So let's set that up. So what I'm going to do is have a constructor. And that's going to take in this HttpClientFactory that we'll call factory. And then we'll have a member of type HttpClient. And we can set that up by just saying underscore HttpClient equals factory.createClient. And then remember, in our program, we had named the particular client. So it'll have multiple clients doing it this way, but we're going to go for that server API that we have there. And so that's created our client. And then in here, the very first thing we'll do is we'll say var, and then we'll call this response equals await. And then on that HTTP client, we're going to remember that this is a post. So we'll do a post async, and that's going to go within the site to API/authentication/login. And then it's going to take a body, which is going to be that login model. So the nice thing about that exactly matches the login model that we are receiving on the other side, because these are both C# now. And so we'll just use this thing called JSON content, which allows us to convert things to JSON. We'll just get hold of the namespace for that. And then on that we say .create, and we pass in the model that we're going to have in there. So that's what that call there is going to look like. Then having done that, we've got to just put in a guard clause. So we're just going to say if, and then it's saying if the response is successful, but actually we want to get out. So we're going to put a not on there, and then we can simply do a throw, and then we'll have a new unauthorized exception, and then just simple message login failed. But if it succeeds, we then need to get hold of the content of that. So now we're going to say var content equals another await, and then we're going to say response.content. We're not going to read as string, we're going to read from JSON async, and then at that point we're going to need to get the model for the data that's coming back when we log in. Now conveniently we've already got that because that's exactly the same data structure as is being sent from the server. So we look here, we've got a class called login response, which is what it's sending when we do the login. And this is one of the really nice things about doing this with Blazor. You've got C# on both ends, so you can use exactly the same code. Now we're kind of assuming here that we're developing the Blazor front end completely separately from the back end, different departments, different organizations even, so we don't actually have the code shared. We could, if we wanted to, actually just share the DLL that contains this, and then exactly the same code we'll be working on both the front and the back end. But I'm going to just kind of cheat that and just do a copy and paste. So if we copy that, and then if we go back to the client, and what we'll do is in the models, we'll add a new class, call that login response, and then just paste in the code that we had. So now we've got exactly the same on the front end and the back end. Now let's go back here and finish this off. So that's going to be our login response in there. And then again, that could fail. So we're just going to do if content equals null, then we'll throw a new invalid data exception. Not going to worry too much about the details of that. And then finally, having done all that, we need to, from that content, get hold of the JWT and store it in session storage. And then we hit a problem because session storage is not something that is available through WebAssembly and therefore not directly available in Blazor. We would have to use JavaScript interop to get hold of that. And that's something we looked at in an earlier video. So we could write that all directly for ourselves with JavaScript interop, but fortunately, like with so many things you need to do with interop, it's already been provided in a NuGet package. So we'll add that in there to save us a bit of effort and save us reinventing the wheel. So if we just get hold of the NuGet packages here, and then we're going to go for a thing called Blazored, and you can see there Blazored.Session. There's also one for local storage, but we're going to get the session storage one, and that just wraps up all that JavaScript interop for us, so we don't have to worry too much about doing that for ourselves. So now in here, what we can do is we're going to have to inject that. So up here, we're also going to have a private session storage service that we've just got from what we added as a NuGet package there. And then let's just add that into the constructor. And so now we've got both of those created in the constructor. And that means that now down here, I can say, again, await. So you'll notice this access to the session storage is asynchronous. We didn't have to worry about that when we're doing it in Angular. The reason being it's not session storage itself that's asynchronous. It's always when you do JavaScript interop, it's asynchronous. So that's why that's got to be like this. And so on that one, we can just do the set item async, and then we're going to need a key. So let's set that up as well. So up here, let's say private const string and then JWT key equals, and then typical thing we may do here, do a name of JWT key. So it just sets that constant to a string, which is its own name. And so that's what we do in the set item async. So we pass in the JWT key, and then not the full content, just the content, and then the JSON web token. And then finally, remember we're returning a date time here. So we return and then content dot expiration. So that's that first bit done. But while we're in here, let's do a few other bits and pieces. Let's also have a method that allows us to get hold of that JSON web token. And in fact, what I'm going to do here to save that call to the session storage every time we want to get hold of it, I'm also going to cache it inside the authentication service. So we're going to have a private nullable string that I'm just going to call JWT cache. And so that will default to null. And then I'm going to have a public async, and this is going to return a value task. We can do that for a little bit of a performance benefit. And I did a video on that quite a while ago if you want to take a look at that. And it's going to return a string. That's going to be the JWT. We're going to call this get JWT async. And then the first thing we do is we check to see whether we've got it cached. So we can say if string.isNull, or I don't think we're in white space there. We're just worried about empty in that case. But if we haven't got anything in the JWT cache, then we're going to say underscore JWT cache equals, and again we've got to now make the call to the session storage, so session storage service, and that's going to be the get item async. That one is going to be type string, and it just takes that JWT key, so that's what we've got there. So simple enough. If it's not cached, we get hold of it, and then we return the cached version, whether that's been there for a while or just been fetched. Next thing we want to do here is have a log out. So let's put that in as well. So again, it's going to be public async. Nothing particularly to return, so we just have the task there. We'll call it logout async. And just like we saw before, all we need to do is we simply need to remove it from the session storage. So we'll say await session storage, and then we've got the remove item async, and again passing the key. But then also we've got to remember to clear the cache, so we'll say underscore JWT cache equals null. Let's get everything done in here while we're here rather than jumping back later on. So there was another thing we wanted to do, remember, which is get hold of the username from the JWT so that we can display it in a friendly way. So let's put that in there. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to write firstly a private method for this. So private static string, and it's going to be called get username. And so the idea is we're going to pass in the JWT and get the username out of that. Now, when I did this in Angular, I did this at quite a low level way using just the standard JavaScript ways of decoding the base64 and that sort of thing. I could do that here, but it's a bit more fiddly. And also there is a library already available that we've actually used that is there for exactly this sort of thing. So what I'm going to do here, I can simply say var JWT equals, and then new, and then a thing called a JWT security token, which I need to get hold of the package for. So let's just install that. And then pass in the textual form of it, so the token that we've got there, and that will generate the actual token object. And we've seen that before, as I mentioned, because again, if we go and have a look at the backend code, and if we take a look in the authentication controller, then that was exactly what we did when we logged in. So when we logged in, remember, we created this JWT security token and passed in all of the bits and pieces directly, the claims and so forth, but now we're creating exactly the same thing, but in the reversed way from the JWT string we had. So that's got that there, and then we can simply read off the claim that we want. So we can say return, and then JWT dot claims dot, and then we'll just go for the first that matches the particular thing we want. That's going to be claim gives claim dot type equals claim types dot name, and then we have to get the value of that. So that's done. I'll get username. And then there's one last thing we've got to do. We need to, from this authentication service, be able to inform people as to when the status of login and logout has changed. So what I'm going to do finally is put on here a public event action, and then it's just going to have a nullable string as a parameter, and we'll call this login change. So whenever the login status change, we're going to send this off, and that string is going to contain the username or null if the person's logged out. And then we just need to fire those. So we fire them in two circumstances. On the logout, we're going to say login change invoke, and then we pass null there because we're logged out. Or on the login, we're going to do the same thing, and that's where we're going to call that get username and pass in the content.jwt token, and so that's going to give us the behavior there. So that's our authentication service fully put together. Let's just also on there give it an interface because this is going to have to be injectable. So we'll do an extract interface, all the public things we want to go in there. And then if we go to our program, then in here we need to do the configuration. And so we need to do a couple of things. We need to do a builder.services. And then here I'm going to do an add singleton because I want that authentication service to be a singleton because remember it had that cached data for the JWT. And if we didn't make it a singleton, then we would sometimes lose that. So better to have it like that. So that's going to be authentication service and then authentication service. So that's all on there. But also we need to configure the injection of that session storage object. And so we'll do another one, builder.services. And then we can do add Blazored.SessionStorage. And then this one again has to be a singleton. So there's actually a method there called as singleton. And I've just got to get hold of the namespace for that. So there we've got it from Blazored Session Storage. So you could either go for add Blazored Session Storage, but that would be scoped, which wouldn't be compatible with that being a singleton. So we go for it as a singleton. And then next thing we've got to do is in the login component, we've actually got to make use of that. So there we've got our task with submit async. And so what I'm going to do in here is let's have a private nullable date time, and that's going to be our expiration. And then we're going to have a private nullable string that we'll call error message. And then in the onSubmit async, we'll put in a try block. And we'll now make use of our authentication service, which we need to inject. So up here, let's say @inject, and then authentication service. Get hold of the namespace for that. And then we'll just call that authentication service. And then back down here, we'll make use of that. So we'll say expiration equals await, and then authentication service dot, and then login async. And we can see we already had, remember, the login model that was bound onto the form. So we can just pass our model in there, and that will give us our expiration. And if that's worked successfully, then we can set the error message to null. On the other hand, if something goes wrong, remember, if anything went wrong with the login, we were throwing an exception. So we'll catch an exception here, and we'll set the expiration to null, and we'll set the error message to ex.message. Then we've just got to do some binding to put that expiration and error message on the form. So what we'll do is down at the bottom, I'm going to say if expiration is not null, then we'll just put in a paragraph. You are logged in until, and then @expiration dot to long time string. And so that will put that information in there. And then we'll also have an if error message is not null, then we'll simply have a paragraph. We use a class that I'm already using elsewhere for error. And then in there, we can just put @error message. And then the last thing I'll do, just like we had before in the Angular, I'm going to say that's disabled if we don't have an expiration. So we'll say @expiration is not null, and that will just grey it out when we're finished. So that should be the basic login all working. So let's run that up. And obviously it can't retrieve the data. We'll go to the login. Let's try it with some invalid login data and click on that. Give it a second, and then we get the login failed, so that's working. Now let's try the correct login. So Jasper Kent, and then PA$W0RD. Login for that one, and we're getting you are logged in until 3 hours from now because that's the time we set. And we can just verify that it's worked correctly because if we look in the session storage, there we've got our JWT key with the token in there. So that's all working. But what we haven't done yet, obviously, is pass that back. So we're still getting failed to retrieve data on the all reviews and the summary. So let's do that next. Now, the way we did that in Angular was to use what Angular calls an HTTP interceptor. In Blazor, very similar concept, but it's called an HTTP handler. So let's put that in there now. So let's put in a new folder called handlers. And then in there, I'm going to add a class called Authentication Handler. And then what we need to do in here, we derive this from a standard class called DelegatingHandler. And so that's what we have there. Then we're going to need a couple of things injected in here. So we're going to need to have a private read-only, and then we're going to use the authentication service that I've already written. So pop that in there, and then we can generate the constructor for that one. And then also we're going to need some configuration information. So I'm going to have a private read-only and then configuration, and we'll add that to the existing constructor. So that's those two set up. Then what we need to do is we do an override of a method from that delegating handler, and that is going to be the send async. So we could do it either send or send async. We are going to have to do some asynchronous code in here, so that's what we're going to have. And then again, if you remember what we did with the Angular interceptor, there are a couple of safety checks we need to put in here. We need to make sure that we've got a JSON Web Token so that we are logged in, but also we need to make sure that this request is being sent to the server for which that JWT applies, not to any of them, because this will intercept all of the requests that are being sent. So first thing to do, we just say var JWT equals await, and then on our authentication service, we've got, that we wrote earlier, the get JWT async, so that's easy enough. And then also we're going to say var is to server. So this is going to check whether we're going back to the correct server. And on this, we're going to say request, so we can see we've got a request coming in here. So this is the request that we want to add extra information to the header in the end. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at the URI, and we're going to check that the absolute URI from that starts with, and then we want to make sure that it's got the address of what we're looking at. And remember, we had that address because we had that in our app settings, so that was just the development one we have, but that's what we want to get hold of, and that's why I need to inject the configuration. So what we're then going to do is in here, we'll say underscore configuration, and then we'll just look up that server URL, and we're going to have a few situations of nulls coming through there, so I'm going to put a double question mark blank there, and also a double question mark false there, and that will mean basically that we've got true or false if it is to the server, just by looking at what's happening there. Then we need to check that both of those are true, so check it is to server, but also that we've got something in that JWT, and if that's all true, then we can finally put the JWT into the authorization header of the request that we're sending. So finally we can say request.headers.authorization equals new, and then it's going to be authentication header value. Get rid of that namespace and pop it at the top, and then that takes the bearer that we've been seeing all over the place with this, and then finally we can pass in that JWT. And then once again, very much like the Angular interceptors, these things can be chained together if you've got more than one thing you want to do. We don't actually have that, but it means we're going to call the base class, which will hand it on to any subsequent handlers that we've got, and then we just await that, and that should be that finished. So we've written our authentication handler. Now we just need to make sure that that is used, and so we go to the program, and here where we had set up the HttpClientFactory, so that's where that was configured, on the end of that I'm going to say dot, and then we'll just say add HTTP message handler, and then the authentication handler that we've just written. But that also itself needs to be registered for injection, so we're going to say builder.services, and this one transient is going to be good enough, and then we can just put in the authentication handler that we've got there. So that should have configured that, and so now, without needing to change the actual review repository or anything like that, when the review repository makes its requests through the HTTP client, then it will go through that handler and it will add the JWT. So let's run that up and see what happens. And we can see that we're getting an error. And if we bring up the console and look at that error, it is not a very easy one to see what's going on. And when I hit this first time, it took me quite a while to work out what's going on. But the problem is we've actually put together a cyclic dependency in terms of our dependency injection. Because if you look at what happens, when we, let's say, create our authentication service, the authentication service in its constructor creates an HTTP client. But when we create an HTTP client, because we've just added that authentication handler, we create an authentication handler. And when we have an authentication handler in its constructor, we inject the authentication service. And we're already in the constructor of the authentication service at this point, so we're in real trouble. So that's actually why we had to do this with an HTTP client factory, not just the plain old HTTP client, so that we can defer that creation. Because what I'm going to do is go into the authentication service, and rather than using the factory to create the client directly in the constructor, I'm actually going to make it so that what we're going to store is the HTTP client factory. So we'll just call that underscore factory. And then in here, we're just going to say underscore factory equals factory. And then the bit of code that actually created the HTTP client, we're not going to have in the constructor because that's what was causing the problem. We're only going to have it when we actually need it, which was down here in the login async, which will happen a lot later on if it happens at all. So that's where we're going to create an HTTP client just as and when we need it, and then that should solve the problem. So now what we're going to see, if we run it up, not logged in at the moment, but if we log in, so we'll put that in there, log in, logged in OK, and if we now go to all reviews or summary, we can see that that is now valid because that authentication handler has put the JWT in the header, it's being received, and everything's working fine. Okay, one last thing to do, we've got to do the logout and we've got to do the message welcoming the user that we did in Angular. So let's just finish it off like that. So what I'm going to do now is add another component. So in Pages, let's add a raise component, and I'm simply going to call this user. And this is going to make use once again of the authentication service. So we'll do an @inject I authentication service, get hold of the namespace and call that authentication service. And then in the code, we will have a private nullable string, which is going to be username, and a private bool called is logged in, which is simply going to say we're logged in if we've got a valid username. So username is not null. Okay, so that's simple enough. We're then going to have a override of onInitialized. Don't need to do anything async here, so that will make life a bit simpler. But here we're going to subscribe to that event that I put in the authentication service. So authentication service and then dot, and then remember we've got this login change, and so we're going to put a handler on that. Remember that gives us the username, so we'll just call that name as the parameter, and then what we're going to do is just say username equals name. One slight problem here, something you'll often encounter when you're using Blazor. If you do something like that, changing one of the fields in response to an event, the Blazor system itself is not going to know that that's made a change, and therefore it's not going to refresh the DOM and give us the new display. And whenever you're in that sort of situation, you're going to need to do a state has changed, so calling a method on the component base class to do that. Normally, I would try and get away without it, see if it works, but very often you'll see it's not working, and I know this is going to work without that status change. So that's what we've got there. And then the other thing we'll put in here is we will have a private async task that we're going to call logout async, and that's where we're going to call the logout on the authentication service. So we'll say await and then authentication service dot logout async. So that was the method that we'd written earlier as well. So that's now used all of the features we had in the service. Let's just put some markup in for that. And it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to say if is logged in. So if we're logged in, we'll have a span that's going to say welcome, and then let's put in that username. And then also we'll put in an anchor that we'll call logout, and that's simply going to call the logout that we've just written. So So there's our logout async. So that's if we're logged in. If we're not logged in, then we're going to need to just have the menu item that takes us to the login. So if we go to our layout page, so there's our main layout. So that's what the menu is currently looking like. So let's cut that. Let's pop in our user component at that point, because that's where we want it to go. And then back in here, we'll just paste in that nav link for login that we've got there. And so now that should be everything working. So if we run that up, so we're not logged in, we'll go to the login page, put in the correct details, click on login, and then you can see we've got welcome, Jasper Kent, we've got the logout button. At the moment we're logged in, so we can see all those things. We click log out, we go back there, and now we're getting the error when we go in there. So exactly the same functionality as we had in the Angular example last time, but with some slightly different techniques because of the different ways that things are done in Blazor and in C# compared with Angular and TypeScript. Okay, so we've seen two front ends there. Next time, it's going to be a different front end, different technology, just to show how all of these work. And so we're going to be doing that in React. So hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, do click like. And to keep up with the next one, do click subscribe. And I'll see you next time.